Fire Emblem Three Houses is a game that really revolves around Byleth, and it's hard to separate them from the world, but I do think it's possible because a lot of the events of the game really are going to happen whether or not Byleth is there, though, of course, they'll probably play out differently. We know that eventually the Empire is going to try and conquer everybody else as long as Edelgard eventually becomes Emperor, and frankly, even Claude has problems with the existing order that would probably bring him into conflict with the Church if left alone long enough. So today, I want to take a deep dive into which side each student would choose if Byleth and Shez were not factors. Now, before we can even start, we kind of need to establish what this hypothetical world would look like, because this is speculation. That being said, I have 100% this game, and I mean that. Not just every difficulty and every route, but every single support conversation in the event log is completely unlocked. So I feel about as qualified as I can be to make the assumptions I have to in order to make a video like this. I'm also not basing it entirely or even that much off of Three Hopes, because Shez does impact the events of that world in a fairly significant way, and a lot of the supports and everything in that game play out differently because the characters don't really get to go to the academy and bond with each other. Which brings me into probably the assumption that even allows this video to exist. How do we take Byleth out of the world? And I don't necessarily mean Byleth doesn't exist, but let's say the Three Lords never need to actually be saved by Byleth. Either the Knights come and deal with Costas, or they never even get into that scenario, and because of that, they never meet Byleth and they continue on as a mercenary. That's pretty much what happens in Three Hopes, except Shez, with all of his nonsense, gets to save them instead. But this time, it's just the Knights. There's no new characters with godly powers that come in and save them. Because of this, everybody at the Academy gets to basically have a full year there without Byleth, but they still get to bond with each other and kind of make the connections that they do with or without Byleth. And yes, I know that you can very easily say none of the students are going to change allegiances because they're not going to talk to anyone outside of their house, but I think we kind of have to assume, if we want to make a video like this at all, that they are going to be mingling and talking and forming bonds with people from every house. Otherwise, this video would be really boring. Anyways, let's begin. I'm not even going to discuss the house leaders, obviously, and I think it goes without saying that Hubert is going to go with the Empire and to do with the Kingdom. While Hilda can side with the Kingdom in-game, that's definitely not happening here. Without Byleth, there's no way she's going to be convinced to leave Claude's side. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk about the rest of the recruitable cast, starting with the Blue Lions. These guys are a generally pretty loyal bunch, and we're going to start with Felix.
Is that all?
Now, Felix is actually somewhat interesting because he does bear a lot of kind of resentment to the Boar Prince, Dimitri, and does share a fair number of supports with people of the Black Eagle House, meaning that there are some conceivable scenarios in which he joins the Empire when the war begins. Despite that, I still feel he would probably stay loyal to the Kingdom overall. I don't see him truly devoted or even really caring about Edelgard's cause, and he even does have some potential endings with members of the Church, like Flayn, so I still believe he's most likely to stay loyal with the Kingdom, or, in a rare scenario, if he finds the Boar King completely unbearable, maybe defect to aid the Alliance instead, but I think this is a fairly solid Kingdom. Next up is Ashe, and this one's probably not surprising.
I cannot lose!
I don't see Ashe siding with anyone other than the Kingdom. He even briefly defects from Byleth in Silver Snow and Azure Moon, so with no Byleth, he 100% sides with the Kingdom and becomes a knight. Now, I know that Ashe's father, Lenato, does have a huge resentment to the Church, and Ashe pretty much just watched them kill her. So I do understand the perspective that he would be naturally inclined to join Edelgard and perhaps fight against the church. But personally, without Byleth to encourage that, I just don't really see that happening. I don't see him really forming that connection and being willing to fight against his homeland just because of that. But I do understand that there are some people who prefer that, and I can see where you're coming from. I just don't think it would happen without a Byleth to influence it. Next up is Sylvain.
See how you like this?
Who I actually expected to be a fairly tough call since he's so easy to recruit in-game. However, I actually still am pretty sure he's just going to side with the kingdom, even if a bit reluctantly. Almost all of his supports and unique endings are with Blue Lions members, and while he does harbor some resentment towards Cress due to what happened with his brother, I just don't think he's going to be swayed to Edelgard's side. I also don't really see Claude convincing him to side with the Alliance since he has so many childhood friends and family and connections to the kingdom. Honestly, it's pretty weird in-game that a female Byleth can just have him switch sides, never talk to him again, and he'll still desert from his homeland 5 years later to aid this professor who recruited him day one. So I actually just think his recruitment in Three Houses is bad and not a very good representation of his character. I'm almost certain this guy is siding with the kingdom. Now, next up is Mercedes, and here's where things get a little interesting.
You may want to move!
We know from Three Hopes that without Byleth, Yuritsa would lead the third house, which means that him and Mercedes would interact a lot more over a full year at the Officers Academy. The real question is, with a full year of no Byleth, would Mercedes realize that Yuritsa is her younger brother or not? I think she probably would. And if she does, I expect she might even follow him. Though I don't necessarily expect her to devote herself to fight for the Empire's cause directly, I think she's going to want to keep her brother safe. Especially because we don't know exactly when the war is going to kick off if Byleth is not a factor. However, this does require a lot of assumptions, more than almost any other pick on this list. So I have to call it a toss-up between the Empire and the Kingdom, hinging entirely on how she and her brother interact during their years at the Academy. Because if they do actually end up growing close, she kind of learns who he is, cares for him again, I could see her kind of throwing everything away to try and do everything she can to protect him. Next up is Annette.
Ready or not!
Annette is also pretty interesting, and I think actually depends on what Mercedes does, but not necessarily in the way you think. Now, Annette actually does have supports with Claude and the other Golden Deer members, and even some endings, but only in Three Houses, not in Three Hopes. Why does this matter? Well, that means those bonds are formed at the Academy. She is, however, very tied to Mercedes because they are like childhood friends. I mean, if you make them fight each other, their battle quotes are like really sad, depressing. Now, it is possible, and maybe even likely, that Annette grows close enough to Claude that she might end up siding with the Alliance, as they aren't real enemies of the kingdom, and it wouldn't necessarily be like betraying her father. But I still only think this could happen if Mercedes ends up kind of discovering that her brother is Yuritsa and going with him to the Empire. So this is another toss-up. If Mercedes stays with the kingdom, I'm pretty sure Annette does as well. But if she doesn't, there's a very real chance that Annette could end up joining the Alliance. That being said, this is another toss-up, but I think this one leans more towards staying with the kingdom. Maybe 60-40. Next up is Ingrid.
Try this on for size!
Who I assumed would be a 100% stay with the kingdom. However, similar to Annette, she has a lot of supports with a lot of different Golden Deer endings, including with Claude, and there is a real chance she could side with the Alliance. Just like Annette, her supports are only in Three Houses and not in Three Hopes, meaning that she is forming these bonds during her year at the Academy. There is, however, a key difference, and that is her character really wants to be a knight, which is much more kingdom-focused than Alliance-focused. Plus, unlike Annette, her childhood friends of Sylvain and Felix are almost 100% chance loyal to the kingdom, unlike Mercedes. While I do think it's possible Ingrid joins the Alliance, I would still give her 80-20 odds of staying loyal to the kingdom and her more long-term friends, unless she happens to grow really close with the Golden Deer members during her year at the Academy. So, I still think she ends up being a recruit for the kingdom. Alright, moving on to Golden Deer, and let's start with a really interesting one, Lorenz.
Don't you know who I am?
Now, Lorenz pretty much only has supports with the Golden Deer, but things get a little more complicated when we zoom out and focus on more of his character than just his supports and bonds. In both games, Lorenz's father almost always sides with the Empire and betrays the Alliance, and it kind of seems like the only one capable of getting him to support anyone other than his father is Byleth. That being said, if Lorenz actually spent enough time around Edelgard to know what her plan is and how she wants to destroy the concept of crests and nobility, it's kind of hard for me to imagine he would really support her over siding with Claude. I have to put Lorenz as a toss-up between the Empire and Alliance because while in-game, he pretty much always follows his father, which again would strongly imply he's going to side with the Alliance, I just don't really think doing so makes a lot of sense for him. It kind of goes against his own interests, other than he wants to be on the winning side, I guess. Still, I think this one has to be a toss-up, and that's partially due to what I almost feel is kind of some poor writing or decisions in the actual game that don't always make sense. Next up is Raphael, who is a little interesting because he actually doesn't have A supports with any house leader, but has B supports with both Dimitri and Claude. Despite that, I actually still feel more or less confident he's probably going to stick to the Alliance. While he would directly benefit from Edelgard's goals, he kind of seems to care most about keeping his family safe, and they all live in Alliance territory. And we also kind of have to admit, while his character is very overhated, he's still pretty one note. It's kind of hard to find any convincing arguments why he would change allegiance as opposed to just keeping the status quo. So, I'm pretty sure he's going to stay with the Alliance. Next, let's talk about Ignat.
I'll show you!
Who, like Raphael, has no real ties to the nobility and would probably benefit somewhat from Edelgard's removal of crests and nobility. Despite this, he has virtually no supports with people outside of Golden Deer, seems to have a real fascination with the saints and the Church of Seros as a whole, so I don't think it's going to be much of a surprise that I kind of think he's just going to stay with the Alliance and the Golden Deer students. I don't think he's going to switch it up. Alright, next up is Lysithea.
You're irrelevant!
And I actually am very confident about this one, and I'm very confident she's going to side with the Empire, at least eventually. Her supports make it clear she despises the fact that she has two crests and the experimentation that was done on her specifically because of the crests, and she wants her family to abandon their position of nobility. I mean, she is well and truly a complete believer in Edelgard's cause, and frankly has a lot in common with the Emperor. Without Byleth, I am actually very confident she'll end up with the Empire eventually. Now, it's possible she doesn't immediately defect right after the Academy. She might need to be convinced, kind of like what happens in-game, but I'm pretty sure that would happen. And if Edelgard actually spent some time getting to know her at the Academy, I'm pretty sure Edelgard would try and sway her to the cause. Next up is Marianne, and she's actually pretty difficult to nail down.
My blood compels me!
Her supports are all over the place, spanning all three houses. And she has endings with both Dimitri and Claude, meaning it's actually pretty easy to justify either house, but also really hard to estimate how out of her shell she would get without Byleth as a factor, or if she would even form bonds with the other students. Because in the game, she's very introverted, and it's largely because of Byleth that she grows at all. Before I get 700 comments about it, Yes, I know Byleth's A support with Marianne implies she would have killed herself if Byleth didn't recruit her. However, that doesn't happen in Three Hopes, and she doesn't even get time to bond with everybody in Three Hopes. So I truly think that if Marianne had a full year to bond with everyone at the Academy, that's not happening. All right? Try and be at least a little hopeful here, okay? Marianne isn't killing herself. All right, don't comment about it. While I'm pretty confident I can rule out the Empire, I'm still really torn going over reading the supports over and over again, trying to decide if I think she would side with the Kingdom or the Alliance. And I really do feel like this is 51% Alliance, 49% Kingdom. Because it's really hard to predict her character growth with Byleth not as a factor. Now, I personally prefer her supports and paired ending with Dimitri as opposed to Claude, but I do think it's slightly more likely she just stays with the status quo as opposed to leaving her homeland to go join the kingdom. But again, she's not that tied to her homeland, so I think either are very possible. The last Golden Deer is Leone.
Pure grit!
And this character is extremely tied to Byleth and Geralt. So removing them makes it actually really hard to figure her character out. While my nominal answer could be that she stays with the Alliance, I actually am pretty confident she'd just become a mercenary, maybe even seeking out Geralt and joining up with him and Byleth after she graduates and just fight for whoever hires her. I don't really feel like she has a very strong tie to any of the sides, and if Byleth and Geralt aren't there, it's entirely possible she just goes out on her own. I know this doesn't necessarily happen in game, but again, it's entirely possible Claude just hired her because he knew her. I don't think she's necessarily tied to any side. So, I'm going to say whoever hires her. We got a whole category for this. I think I specifically called it Doesn't Fight, but it's really just not picking a side. Anyway, moving on to the Black Eagles. And let's start with Ferdinand.
I am Ferdinand von Eyck.
This should be a pretty simple one. I just don't see him betraying his homeland. Regardless of any bonds he forms, especially with the Golden Deer students, it's always very clear that his noble duty comes first. And even though Edelgard has basically promised to destroy the nobility, he's also really dedicated to being her rival for some reason. So I just know he's not leaving his homeland. I think this is a very safe call to say he's staying with the Empire. Moving on.
I guess I have to.
Let's discuss Linhardt, a character I actually never found that interesting, to be honest. Don't crucify me. He's got a very lazy attitude and just wants to research and relax. And I'm pretty skeptical he's going to go out of his way and side with anyone other than the Empire. Again, there's a chance he spawns enough with the Knights to side with the Church, but I wouldn't bet on it. Pretty sure he's just going to take the path of least resistance, and that's going to be the Empire. Interestingly, online, I've seen a lot of people who think Linhardt would be one of the go-to people to kind of leave the Empire, but I gotta be honest, I'm kind of not sure I really agree with that sentiment. I don't really see a world where he kind of, without someone like Byleth to push him away, actually expands his way of thinking enough to desert. Again, I feel like he's almost more of a draw for students like Lysithea and Happy to join the Empire rather than actually someone willing to be pulled away from the Empire. Next up is Caspar.
Here we go!
This guy actually has a surprising amount of support with the Golden Deer students and the various Knights of the Church, but I still don't think he would defect from the Empire without the influence of a Byleth figure. Now, it is true that Caspar, as the second son to a noble family of the Empire, has basically no real ties to the Empire, or at least no incentive to continue to side with them. But this is where I disagree a little bit with some people online who think he's an easy person to leave the Imperial forces if given the opportunity. Because I think, at least in this scenario where he has a full year to bond with everybody, that will include Edelgard, who would probably realize his usefulness and make a concerted effort to make sure he stays. After all, she's pretty much made it clear to him in their support that she'd be happy to promote him to a general as long as he's qualified, and certainly seems like he's qualified. So I feel like the fact that he has direct gains from the system Edelgard is trying to implement would overcome some of the offset that would necessarily discourage him from being a part of the Empire. If anything, he's going to be a pull from those Golden Deer students to defect to the Empire to join him. I don't see him dropping his nation without a really strong influence directly convincing him not to. And since he doesn't really have supports with Claude, who's about the only person I think might be able to do that, I don't see him siding with anyone but the Empire. Next up, we have Bernadetta.
Get back!
I'm afraid another somewhat one-note character. While she does have a lot of great supports and endings with non-Empire characters, especially with Sedith, I just don't see her getting out of her shell without a Byleth there to push her. She does have enough supports with Blue Lions members to make a case for defection, but it's a weak one. The Empire might as well be one giant comfort room for her. It's what she knows. The game makes it very clear she doesn't want to leave her room and what she knows. So I just don't really see her siding with anyone but the Empire. Not even because she wants to, but because, kind of like Linhardt, it's the path of least resistance. Next up is Dorothea, who I actually think is worth discussing a bit.
This is going to hurt.
She has a lot of supports with other houses, especially the Blue Lions, and in every route she is extremely empathetic, takes death and this whole war very seriously. Because of this, without Byleth, I actually just don't think she's going to be fighting in the war. At least not on the direct front lines. You can make a pretty solid case that she might aid the Empire as a medic, and maybe she'll grow close enough to Edelgard that Edelgard might call on her to be part of her direct kind of strike force. But Dorothea always struck me as only fighting because of Byleth, rather than a specific devotion to the cause. So I'm going to go put her down in that category of probably not fighting, at least not directly. Lastly, we have Petra,
I will remove you!
who may be a little bit controversial. I actually feel moderately confident in saying that Petra would probably side with the Alliance or not fight at all. She actually has some really good supports with Claude and a variety of other Golden Deer and Church members, but especially with Claude himself. They're both not tied to Fodlan, they have unique paired endings, and she has A rank supports with Claude and only a B rank with her own house leader Edelgard. I'm actually fairly confident Petra would be willing to fight with the Alliance, although I could be convinced that due to her ties and bonds with the variety of the Golden Deers and Claude, she would go back to Bridget and simply refuse to help the Empire in their fight because she does not want to fight against Claude. I'm still putting her in Alliance though, I'm biased. Alright, the three main houses are done, but we aren't over yet. First, let's quickly breeze through all the recruitable church members. Blaine, Sedith, Catherine, and Cyril. Guys are staying loyal to the church, and their church alone. Now, Byleth can recruit Alois for any route. However, without Byleth, I don't think he's leaving the church. Unless maybe he runs into Gerald like he does in the Three Hopes, but again, I still think he's going to stay loyal to the church. Also, Gilbert is going to the kingdom. Come on. Alright, Shamir is the first of the knights with any nuance. It's very clear she has no specific loyalty to the knights or the church, and is really only there to repay a debt. I don't think she's going to favor any one side, but based on her supports, it's pretty plausible that either she's going to get kept on the knight's payroll, or she'll bond enough with Claude that maybe he hires her when the war kicks off. Now, the professors are where things are really interesting, and let's start with Hanneman.
I found a weak point.
Now, despite Hanneman devoting his life to crests and the study of crests, if you actually watch his supports, especially with Edelgard, it makes it clear that he has a big grudge against the system of everything that prioritizes having a crest and everything that's been built up because of that. He suffered a personal loss, like an actual family member died simply because they were born without a crest. And I guarantee you, he harbors a lot of resentment for that. While it is possible, I can hear the argument that after the war kicks off, he's just going to move to the kingdom and teach in their school of sorcery. I don't think so. I'm pretty confident that once he realizes what Edelgard's goals are, he's going to end up siding with the Empire. Lastly, we have Manuela,
Enchanting, right?
who, much like Hanneman, has ties to the Empire as well as a lot of supports. While, unlike Hanneman, she also has pretty strong ties to the Church, I still feel like either she's going to side with the Empire or just stay out of the fight entirely, which is pretty much what happens if she's not recruited by Byleth in the base game. And we're not done yet. Let's talk about the secret 4th house and who they would side with. Starting with their leader, Yuri.
Let's wrap this up.
Most of Yuri has very spread out supports and very clearly favors no direct side in the conflict, only even siding with the professor due to knowing it's going to be the winning side. Leaning a little bit more on Three Hopes, we get to see that in that war, Yuri typically helps whoever he feels is going to benefit him the most, which often ends up being the kingdom due to some family ties there. Despite that, I actually think Yuri is one of the best cases of not going to side with anyone specifically, and just keep looking out for himself and his own people, because committing to a cause is just putting them at risk. Next up, we have Balthus.
See ya!
And he's a lot more straightforward. This dude's helping the Alliance, like 100%. He has really strong ties to Hilda and Claude, as well as his family having deep roots in the Alliance territory. There's like no way he's not siding with the Alliance. I think he's a firmer side with the Alliance than some of the Golden Deer students. Next up, Constance.
A party gift!
Similar to Balthus, Constance has strong ties to the Empire, and nearly every single support is with an Empire unit. She wants to restore her family name. It was an Imperial family. Helping Edelgard does seem like the logical way to do that, even though Edelgard is keen on destroying the nobility. Despite that, I still think Constance is probably going to be siding with the Empire, if not interfered with at least. Lastly, we have Happy.
Back off!
And her hatred of the Church is abundantly clear in her supports. So my natural assumption is that she's going to lean towards siding with the Empire. Despite that, she actually has a lot of supports with Kingdom students, especially Dimitri, making this kind of a toss-up between the Empire and the Kingdom. It comes down to, does her hatred of the Church outweigh the bond she makes with Dimitri and the Blue Lions during her year at the Academy? Personally, I would say probably not. I would slightly lean towards her siding with the Empire or just staying out of it, but it really is a toss-up. I think you can make an argument either way. And there we have it. That's our finished list. Let me know what you thought of it. If you have anyone you strongly disagree with or something I hadn't considered, let me know. I know I kept this video pretty short. I could have gone into way more detail on every character, but I don't want to start digging through the support wads and showing you everything, because that would make this video take 20 times as long. Because there really is a lot that goes into most of these characters. There's only a few that are truly one note, where I'm completely confident in the ranking I made. So I expect you'll probably disagree with at least one of the calls I made. So if you do, tell me why specifically, because I'd love to read. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day.